doing an episode in Groot speak. That's the April Fool's episode. Or is it? So last week I talked about my play kit and how you guys should make sure you have a good majority of what I have, as well as your own stuff to mark what you need. That said, this week I want to talk about watching your opponent. Now, one of the most talked about things is you missed something your opponent could do. I forgot that my opponent could do this. I didn't know my opponent's figure could do this. Knowledge of your opponent is 75% more difficult, 99% more difficult even, than knowing what your team does. Now, this of course gets, I gotta say, like, I'm probably going closer to 75% because a good portion of the people that are playing what's commonly played. So you kind of know, for the most part, what the figure across the table is going to do. There gets to be a certain number of figures that do get very good in a different type of meta. Right now we're in, our meta has kind of dipped into a point where there's actually about 6, we're down to 6 figures that are commonly showing up. Although that's about to change too because watch list. So we'll see how that goes. But knowing your opponent's team is just as important as knowing your own team. And there's a couple of habits you can get into with regards to tournament play that could really help a better understanding of your opponent's team. Now, step 1, I start every Nationals figures, every major tournament game with one major habit. I turn to my opponent and say, can I see your cards? Would you like to see mine? The reason I do this, and it's very important that we do this, you have to know what your opponent's traits are. You have to know what your opponent's special powers are. You have to know what your opponent ignores when targeting. You have to know what your opponent has eventually at all points on the dial. Now, granted, you're not going to ask your opponent, can I see your figure's dial beforehand? That's just not going to happen. But knowledge of the powers that they have on that dial is very effective. As well, when you're starting the game, you want to ask, do they have this power on their first click? Now, there's a couple common sense ones. Not a great, like, unless it's traded, not a lot of characters start with Steel Energy. And the ones that do start with it traded also start on a later click. So it's a good idea to know what that later click looks like, that third click in most Wild Dial characters, except for, I think, Jubilees or fourth click or something ridiculous like that. But these Wild Dial Vampire-style characters will have a less good starting dial than what they could possibly eat their way up to. And it's good to know that they could be eating their way up to that, so that you know whether or not you need to keep your distance, whether or not you need to keep that guy damaged, whether or not you may have to mitigate some kind of control of that board against that figure. As well, knowing what they ignore, you don't want to get caught off guard and say, well, my guy has stealth. My guy has ignore hindering terrain for shooting. Well, hell. Can't tell you how many times I've done that in a regular tournament, like not the high-level tournaments. I'd say 2 or 3 times a week when I go to a local level tournament, because I keep forgetting keep that habit. Now, here's the other part I want to talk about when it comes to habits. You've got to maintain a habit in order to make it useful. And that means that, yes, at the local level with this particular habit, you're going to be annoying some characters. Now, some cases, you guys are going to know what a lot of the figures in your opponent's team do, and that's okay. But if there's a character that you have a shred of doubt on, that's the character you want to make sure you read their card on. For instance, I know that the figure 001 Iron Man from the Invincible Iron Man set has ignore hindering, ignore blocking, breaks it, and ignore... No, that's it, as far as ignores terrain. But he does have certain powers on his dial that I might not be familiar with. So at that point, I say there's a shred of doubt. I need to look at this card and ask my opponent for the card. This is not against the rules. This is not you being a jerk. This is you playing the game and being ready. There's a certain level of surprise you're allowed, and there's a certain level of surprise you're not allowed. You're not allowed surprise of what your opponent's powers do and when they get them. What you are allowed to be surprised on is what their dial looks like. And that could be unavoidable in most cases. It's not beneficial to memorize dials. I mean, there are some dials it's good to know, and it's good to know when certain things are coming up. Examples, the 180-point Kyle Rayner giveaway figure. Don't deal 3 clicks of damage with him unless you're going to be dealing more damage after the fact because you have a problem coming up. Sodom Yat, if you do a bunch of damage to him and his stats are starting to look a little low, you might be time to cool it on him unless your opponent has a healer, because those later clicks are going to hurt if you aren't ready for them. So these are the kinds of things that you gotta know occur. There's a couple standards that are pretty safe to assume as well. There's a few figures, like for instance the White Lanterns have a consistency of having stop clicks. Those stop clicks are generally located on the last click of that dial and come with regeneration. A stop click that comes with something like regeneration is probably a late click. So you're not worrying about that for most of the game, with exceptions, of course, like Entity. Entity has 4 stop clicks that are just obnoxious. But knowing, to a certain degree, a figure that's going to be on the board a lot, it's good to know these kinds of facts about them. Am I right? So, as a quick aside as well, knowing your opponent's board as well as yours is just as important too. Watching your opponent's maneuvers is actually more important than watching your own. You know, going into a tournament, I hope you know, for the love of God, I hope you know, going into a tournament, what your team does. If you know what your team does, then the next step is knowing what your opponent's team does. And if it's one of those teams that didn't come off the internet, it's time to watch the way your opponent is moving and remember those powers that are on those dials. Because if you don't know what's on there and what's about to hit you, you could be in for a bad surprise. And bad surprises cost games, especially the big bad surprises. So, know your opponent's stuff, watch your opponent's motions, and be ready to react to those things. Makes a player better as a habit. That's all I got for this week. I hope you see you guys next week, and don't forget, practice makes your team better.
Metafix is brought to you by Majestics Comics, Collectibles, and Games down in Costa Mesa, California, near the Orange County Fairgrounds, where they play Heroclix 3 times a week in that store. Don't live anywhere near Costa Mesa, California, or the Orange County Fairgrounds like us? Check down below, we have a link to their web store and their eBay store, where they're always updating with all kinds of new Heroclix singles. Patrick's winning them all the time, so it's a good time to check whenever there's a big tournament around and he's winning.